Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are waiting for folks to join, so we'll start the webinar shortly. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining, welcome to the webinar on the lupus patient journey. I'm Jennifer Lannon, Director of Partnerships for Real World Solutions at Alira Health. I'll be your host and moderator, but we are going to wait maybe another minute to start for others to trickle in because we still have some names joining. Okay, guys, welcome again to this webinar on the lupus journey and undressing unmet patient needs. I'm Jennifer Lannon, again, Director of Partnerships in the Real World Solutions team at Alira Health. I'm going to be hosting today's discussion, and before we start, I wanted to give a few quick notes. You guys are all muted. Sorry, or you're welcome. I'm not sure which to say there. We won't hear you, which might be a good thing if you have things going on in the background, but if you have questions, you will need to ask them in the little chat box using the toolbar. So they will accumulate during the session, and then we'll address them all in the Q&A at the end, which we're going to try to start in about 40 minutes, leave the final 20 minutes of the hour for Q&A. This is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording afterwards. You can either rewatch it, or we hope that you might share it with someone else that you think might find the content that we shared today valuable. Finally, I want to introduce Alira Health, which is the organizer of today's webinar. We are a global healthcare firm with a mission to humanize healthcare and life sciences in partnership with patients. We provide consulting and clinical services enabled by technology and real-world evidence. And from development to medical care, we support our pharma, biotech, and medtech clients with a full spectrum of services across the entire solutions lifecycle of life sciences. So I'll introduce today's speakers and myself. I guess I'll go first. So I am on the Real World Solutions team at Alira Health, and as a Director of Partnerships, one of the partnerships I manage is with Forward, which is why I'm here today. Forward's the National Data Bank for Rheumatic Diseases. People with lupus have been donating their data to Forward since the 1990s, so very longitudinal, but we're working with Forward on a partnership to be even more engaging and provide more value to participants for donating their data, and also to make sure we're refreshing the data that we're collecting so it's even more valuable to the life science community and the research community. Jen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Jennifer Medlin. I'm one of the rheumatologists. I'm over at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and I am the director of the lupus clinic here, and I'm actually in clinic now, so apologize for my very, dreary background here, but happy to be here.
No apologies needed. It makes you even more authentic. Thank you for making the time to be with us. Christina, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good morning. My name's Christina McGurk. I am a lupus patient. I have had lupus for 30 years. I am a mother. I am also a chief nursing officer for a large healthcare system, and so been on that journey. And I have a soon-to-be 25-year-old daughter. So happy to be part of the webinar today to share my experience with all of you.
Thanks so much, Christina. Yes, you bring a lot of different perspectives to this, so we're very grateful to have you here. And finally, Julia.
Nice to meet you all. I am Giulia Pierini, Principal in the Patient Engagement Department of Alira Health. I've been working in this vertical of Alira Health for the past 5 years, and what we do is strategically support pharmaceutical companies or the industry in meaningfully implement the patient perspective during product development. And we have been working also in the lupus area in the past couple of years, so happy to be here.
I used to be on Julia's team, the patient engagement team at Alira. So the patient engagement team and philosophy is very near and dear to my heart as well. So we're glad to have that in this discussion. And as a reminder, the topic of today, which you signed up for, is the lupus journey of people with lupus and addressing unmet patient needs. So to start, it might help to center us about just like a very quick overview of lupus. Some of you might be new to this space. Jen, I think you would be the most appropriate person to give us a quick definition of what lupus is, and maybe also about some of the different manifestations of lupus, because some people might, for example, only be doing research in lupus nephritis or cutaneous lupus.
Yeah, so and that's always a hard thing to describe lupus briefly, but I will do my best. So it's an autoimmune disease that we call it multisystemic because it can affect multiple organ systems. It tends to predominantly affect women. So about 90% of patients with lupus are women, but it can kind of hit the whole spectrum of ages. We've got pediatric onset all up to late onset lupus, which we call after the age of 50, which is a little bit less common. But it can affect any organ. So lupus nephritis or kidney involvement is one of the more common ones. Over 50% of people have kidney involvement. And cutaneous, you mentioned skin involvement, it's very common as well. And so these patients can present very differently. It's kind of a unique autoimmune disease where, you know, with RA, we kind of know what to expect. You're going to have a lot of joint pain, swelling. Maybe you're going to have lung involvement, some of these other things. But lupus, every lupus patient looks different. So they may present with just kidney involvement. I've had patients just with kidney involvement, some that have mostly just skin and joints, others that have kind of the whole spectrum, or brain involvement, heart involvement. So it can look very different. But again, expect to see it more in premenopausal women is the most common population we see it in. And then, you know, it's a chronic disease, doesn't go away. So we see them lifelong, treat them lifelong, and just a wide spectrum on, you know, medications. I know we're going to get into some of that later on and how we treat it and how we approach kind of treatment throughout their lifespan. But that's kind of a brief overview.
I know, and obviously people spend their whole lives studying lupus, so we try our best to nail it down into a 60-second overview. And then for the purposes of today's webinar, I wanted to give some overviews of challenges that we've seen at various stages of the life science and, you know, biopharmaceutical research life cycle in lupus in particular. So people who are developing lupus assets in clinical and then also post-marketing for lupus assets. One of the things that we see is it can be very hard to confirm a lupus diagnosis. A lot of people might think that they have lupus, but it can be actually quite hard to get a verified diagnosis. It's also so heterogeneous, as Jen was mentioning, not only in the different organs that it can impact, the different symptoms that people can have. Response to treatment can be very varied. So, you know, there's no magic pill that works for everyone. The patient reports of how they're doing with lupus, you know, tend to be around pain, fatigue, brain fog. What physician reports are typically around disease activity and organ damage. And so we have these two very important indicators of how patients are doing, but they tend to be very different and they don't always align. They're not always saying the same thing. The organ involvement, we've also heard it's very hard to track whether it's actually from lupus. So, you know, if you're having brain fog, how do we know that's because of your lupus and not because of something else? And then a very important one, I think, also is that it's overly prevalent and tends to have worse outcomes in underrepresented groups of research. And so we have a lack of as much historical data on these groups because they have been historically underrepresented in research. And then, you know, they also might be hard to reach now. You know, if we want to enroll a diverse population that's representative of, you know, people that have lupus, it can be hard to engage the right people and make sure that we're getting the right distribution. Julia, did you want to hop in and chat about what you've heard in working with clients about the lupus and working with life science clients about lupus and what's been important for them, why it's been important to understand the lupus patient journey?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I have to say that you mentioned most of it. What I can add is that although it seems obvious, I would like to specify that when we refer to patient journey, we mean an exercise that in the industry field has to be done listening to the patients and the caregiver's voice, and not only to the physician one. Not because the physician one is more or less important, but they are equally important. And as you rightly mentioned, they are very different. So it's key to have the perception and the journey of patients from the patient perspective. And it has to be a patient journey that you go in depth in what are the unmet needs of the patient population. You mentioned some, for example, late diagnosis is one of the most established one in lupus, but there are many. Impacts on quality of life, expectations towards treatments, etc. And this is an exercise that per se is not sufficient, as we have already started seeing and saying that there is a diversity within the patient population in terms of age, race, and gender. And that's why the patient journey for lupus specifically needs to be deep dive into each specificity of each subpopulation of lupus, because this diversity-based factor is key for meaningful product development. So yeah, that would be my intake from this.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia. So on that note, let's actually get a patient perspective on this panel. Christina, why don't you talk at the beginning? We were talking about delays in diagnosis and how the diagnostic journey can be really challenging. If you don't mind, we would love to hear a bit about your diagnostic journey.
Absolutely. So as I have mentioned, I have had SLE or systemic lupus for 30 years. I was in my early 20s, working, going to school, going to college, and I would find myself aching, my joints were aching, I was exhausted, and I had really bad migraines, which now I know, lupus migraines, right? So I would end up going to the doctor because I'm like, oh, something's wrong. And they go, oh, you're just doing too much. I go home, I take a couple days off, I feel a little bit better, and then I get worse again. And so it was this cycle to the point that I probably did that for about a year. And honestly, I hated calling and making an appointment with the doctor because although I had been going there a long time, I got to the point where I felt like they thought I was a hypochondriac because I kept going and it was general complaints. I have mentioned that I was in college. I was going to school to become a nurse. And one day went to school and we were looking at autoimmune disorders. And I started reading on lupus. And so the next time I didn't feel well, I went in and I asked my provider, I said, can you please order these tests? We were reading on lupus and it just sounds like me. And she's like, absolutely, because at this point she felt bad for me. And it was probably a week later, she called me late at night, which I knew was the first sign. And then she started off by apologizing in the sense that she had to give me news. She said, good news is we know what it is now. Bad news is you have systemic lupus and you need to go see a rheumatologist. So I was scared, but relieved at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your personal journey there. Going over to Jen, I wanted to ask you, how difficult do you see it as, diagnosing lupus, and what are the diagnostic criteria for you have lupus?
Yeah, so I think Christina obviously brings up a really good point, is that I think the initial challenge is just suspecting lupus, because once you suspect it, we have really good diagnostic tests now. So we've got good serology, so obviously ANA being non-specific, but we have a lot of other specific ANA-associated antibodies that can really help us. And then we kind of use clues from other things like, do they have protein or blood in their urine that shouldn't be there? Do they have cytopenias, low blood counts? So I think once you kind of are kind of honed in that maybe lupus is on the differential. We have really good diagnostic tests that can be used. I think the problem is getting to the point where you suspect lupus, because as Christina mentioned, sometimes people go to their doctors and they're very nonspecific symptoms initially. It's like, well, I'm tired, I've got aches, and maybe my hair is falling out. And so for an example, I just had a patient I diagnosed last month where she was attributing all of her symptoms to thyroid. She had thyroid cancer early this year and got her thyroid removed. And she's like, well, they're just trying to find the right thyroid dose for me, and this is why I feel tired. But then she started getting mouth sore, started getting joint pain, leg swelling, and eventually she was just kind of like, something else is going on. She had a great primary care doctor, which is always the great, if you've got a primary care doctor that listens to you and is willing to check things, that's obviously going to help a lot. I'm getting you to the rheumatologist, and so thankfully she had a primary care doctor who listened to her and said, hey, let me just check some other labs, and profoundly high double-stranded DNA and protein in her urine, and she got it right over to me. And so, but it's easy even for patients to be like, well, maybe this is just, I'm tired, I have kids, I'm working, I have thyroid issues, so it can be really difficult in the beginning depending on how it manifests. If they come with really bad skin lupus, sometimes that's a little easier way to kind of get diagnosed, because you've got objective outward signs that you can point are clearly not normal. But it can be challenging with some of these symptoms initially. But once you've got on the radar, thankfully we have really good diagnostic tests.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, and on the rash and skin involvement, butterfly tends to be a symbol of the lupus community, because the butterfly rash does tend to be a more obvious outward sign that it might be lupus, but so many patients don't have that. And so, Julia, my question to you is, what do you think is relevant from this diagnostic conversation for the life sciences community? One thing that I wanted to make sure we pointed out is, obviously Christina is one of the most informed in patients that you can get. You're a chief nursing officer at a hospital now, and you were in nursing school. If you hadn't been in nursing school, you probably wouldn't have known to think of lupus. And so I want to make sure we're all centered around, not every patient has the amount of health literacy that you have. And, I want to make sure we're not forgetting, the journey of other patients that are obviously not here in the room. But Julia, what else do you think is important for the life science community and researchers to know?
We mentioned already two very important points, late diagnosis and misdiagnosis. So based on our research in the past years, we have seen that on average, of course, taking into account the different geographies, etc., a diagnosis of lupus can be delayed from 2 to 7 years, because the primary care physicians are sometimes not aware of the disease because it's rare, they have outdated information, the symptomatology do not appear all at once, it appears now, they accumulate with times, the symptoms, and sometimes the primary care physician struggle in making a diagnosis. And also Christina mentioned a very valid point. Sometimes it's also misdiagnosed with, for example, mental condition. It's very often the case, especially when a disease that has a lot of prevalence in women. Unfortunately, this is an easy conclusion. Sometimes mental condition, tiredness, fibromyalgia is also another thing that lupus is always confused with. From an industry perspective, it's easy to understand how this can create a lot of problems in the real patient journey in terms of patient mobilization, access to the right specialists, and as such, access to care. But also, Christina mentioned this as well, patients have a up and down in terms of emotional journey, especially a big down usually now. I'm taking an average here and from the statistics that we have, but they have a down in terms of emotional reaction before the diagnosis, and then the diagnosis as a moment of relief, because at least you know what is happening. But then there is also other factors that jump in right after the diagnosis related to treatment. I guess we will talk about it later today. And this impairs a lot how they react towards a new treatment, the trust and the responsiveness that can have to that. So this is very important topics to consider for an industry and a company that wants to explore this arena. And the only way to really grasp this information in depth is talking to patients and understand their journey and their emotional journey as well.
Thanks so much. So yeah, let's talk about treatment now. So Christina, you got that call, you went to a rheumatologist. What was it like navigating the different treatment options, and not just up front, but I know you've had to navigate a lot. So deciding which ones to try, when to stop one and try another, what have been your key sources of information in making those decisions? Tell us a bit about your treatment journey.
Yeah. So, when I first was diagnosed, like I said, it was very general symptoms, fatigue, joint pain. Those were my major symptoms I was having that was impacting my life, right? I would sleep 18 hours a day. I would get up for a little bit and then be exhausted again. So it was really about what I needed at that time to help kind of get the inflammation under control. So I started on I think general medications for lupus. They started me on Plaquenil, one to help with fatigue, also helps with joint pain. I didn't have any rashes to begin with. And then of course steroids, right, to help. And then I got placed on Celebrex. And then, so for the first 10 years of my journey with lupus, it was very much around joints, fatigue. I had ulcers in my mouth, my nose, which is very uncomfortable. Hair would fall out some. I did have one bout of pericarditis, kind of out of the blue, but the first 10 years to me were just, I don't know, they weren't too major. And then my journey changed. I started having simple partial seizures, got placed on medication for seizures, very much felt part of a flare for lupus. I stayed on that medication along with all the other medicines for about 4 years, and then the simple partial seizures went away. But then my lupus really started focusing on muscular as well as nervous system, right? Brain. So over the last 10 years, that has been the focus, where when I have a flare, I have extreme muscle weakness to the point that I fall and it's difficult for me to walk. You can imagine that's difficult to work and do other things. I also ended up with peripheral neuropathy, so I couldn't feel portions of my body, my toes. My neuro assessment was off. I had hyper reflexes. They really thought I had a cerebritis, but I did not, which was wonderful. But my journey, this 30 years, you can imagine I went through multiple medications, right? So I've been through Imurin, I've been through Cellcept, I've been through PO methotrexate or pill form methotrexate. My stomach, of course, is a mess. My treatment right now is still a combination. I still take Plaquenil to this day. I don't have any problems with that. I had to stop taking Celebrex probably 15 years in. It started, my kidneys didn't like it anymore. I take steroids every single day. I take methotrexate injections to protect my stomach. And with the last flare, we had to go back on an oldie but goodie, which is my Fortic. I've been through the biologics, the Benlysta, the Safnello. I take them for a period of time and then my body rejects them. So we have to go back to steroids. So my blessing has been throughout the journey, there have been other medications that come on the market. My rheumatologist and I, over the years, get proactive in the sense of, okay, we've got you under control right now. Here's what I want you to think about. And she gives me literature to read on potential next therapies, because she doesn't want me to think about it when I'm not feeling well. She wants to meet me have a decision when I'm feeling well. And then we know when the next one comes, here's going to be our direction on it. So research to me is really important, because I'm one of those people that I've had it so long, I really need that next medication to come out for my next flare.
Well, I think you've just, in that segment, summed up the unmet need right there. You know, these new medications, it seems like any new medications that come to the market, you're always kind of looking out for and looking for what can be the next medication when the one that you're on stops working or you have a flare come up. Jen, I wanted to ask you, when you're thinking about what treatment a patient should be on, what's going through your mind, either like, you know, a first-time patient, what you're going to get them started out on, and then maybe changing treatment, what goes through your mind and what you're recommending?
Yeah, so no, I think Christina brought up a really good point, and that there's just so much of an unmet need for new medications compared to, like, I treat rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis, so we have so many new medicines all the time, so many to choose from. Like, almost it's like an abundance of of choices I can give my patients. And like lupus, it's like, well, we have these really old medicines been around for a while, and then fortunately in the last 5-10 years we've had some new biologics and medications, but it could be challenging. And so and like as Christina mentioned, hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil is definitely still our baseline medication. And we know it's a great medicine for lupus, helps prevent flares, progression. It's really, really good for patients who are going to get pregnant at reducing adverse pregnancy outcomes. So that's always a good baseline. But a lot of patients like Christina, we need to add medications. That's not enough for all patients. So then it kind of depends, on how it's affecting them. So we use a lot of mycophenolate, Myfortic. We use a lot of Imuran for people with, kidney involvement or serositis like pericarditis. If they've got kidney involvement and it's really severe, sometimes we need to use cyclophosphamide still, or if they do have cerebritis. So it kind of depends on how it's affecting them. Skin involvement, I've been using a lot of Safnello lately. That's been really effective for really refractory skin. So, every patient's different. You really have to tailor it to the patient depending on how it's manifesting. And then the other thing we have to take into account, which I'm sure Christina came across when she was first diagnosed, is if they're pregnancy age and they want to get pregnant, it's making sure they're not on medications that are really toxic, like mycophenolate or methotrexate. So timing it as well with pregnancy and things like that are really important. So, but yeah, there's definitely still an unmet need. I have patients that have been through all the medicines and still active. So it's really exciting to see how the trials are going on, but it's definitely needed.
So I'm going to go a little bit out of order since we started talking about pregnancy, and this is something that comes up a lot when I talk to researchers and patients with lupus, is Christina, if you're open to it, we would love to hear your journey. I know you mentioned you got diagnosed 30 years ago and you had your daughter 25 years ago. So it would be great if you could share what it was like, the journey of getting pregnant and being pregnant when you have lupus.
Yeah. So I always say my daughter's name is Courtney, and she is just absolute blessing to us. So early on, I was dating my husband, my now husband. At the time, we've been married 29 years. So when you think of the math, I was diagnosed before we got married, right? And so I had a really significant conversation with him and said, look, I don't know if you want to sign up for this. But of course, he's a strong man, and he said, yes, I'm in it. We were married for a couple of years, and then we started approaching the conversation about having a child. I had significant conversations with my rheumatologist. I did a lot of research. And then my husband and I, we went to a high-risk OBGYN, and we just had a session just to talk about it. And so after that conversation, we decided to go ahead and at least explore it. We did a lot of testing prior to see if I had some antibodies, and that would show that I probably would not do well during a pregnancy. And in reality, everything looked great. So what they told me was, if we could get pregnant when I was not in a flare, that it appears that people do really well during their pregnancy. So we planned the entire pregnancy. I was able to get pregnant the first time very quickly, and I needed to come off all my medicine. However, I was nervous about it, but I will tell you, I was the healthiest while I was pregnant. I did end up getting gestational diabetes and had to take some insulin, but that was easy peasy. And then once she was born healthy to the point I was like, after probably 6 months, I'm like, I want to do this again because I had felt so good. And my whole family, including my husband, said, we are not testing fate twice. So, my learnings from that is just to become very knowledgeable. Preparation is key, and just blessed that it worked out for us.
Oh, well, we're so glad that you have Courtney in your life and everything worked out great. Jen, obviously, we heard Christina's fabulous story. That was 25 years ago. So maybe you can give us an update on what do you currently recommend to patients that are considering pregnancy? and maybe talking a bit about like pregnancy safe medications versus or if there are any medications that aren't officially designated as pregnancy safe that you might still either allow a patient to take or recommend they take. I know this is a really complicated piece of the lupus journey.
Yeah, it definitely is. I would say, I mean, some things have changed, but overall not much either. I have patients like Christina where they're like, actually, I felt really good during pregnancy. I did really well. And so that's always exciting to see. I would say overall, lupus does tend to be one of the autoimmune diseases that can flare during pregnancy versus like psoriatic, RA. They tend to kind of go a little quiet during pregnancy, but not always the case for lupus. And so it is something that always makes us a little bit nervous, especially my colleagues. If they have a pregnant lupus patient, they tend to send them to my way because they get very nervous about treating it. But like Christina said, preparation is key. Like patients who prepare ahead of time, make sure their lupus is well controlled, that they're on pregnancy safe medications, tend to do so much better. And so I try to stress that with my patients, because a lot of them, especially if they were diagnosed as a kid, they kind of grow up hearing that they should never have a baby. Like, oh, it's not in your cards, you shouldn't do it, it's not safe. And so we're trying to get away from that stigma, because it's just not true. A lot of patients with lupus can safely have babies. You just need to go and prepare to reduce the adverse events. So I typically try to ask my patients who are pregnancy age when I see them, have any interest in getting pregnant in the next year? And so I try to have that as a question I have for everybody, so I know ahead of time so that we can have that conversation. And it really is enlightening to see that patients sometimes have that perception that, no, I can't have babies, so I wasn't planning on it. And then kind of talking to them, you just hear that they've been told that. And I try to correct that and say, hey, we can go through this journey together. Obviously, it requires kind of following with me regularly, following with high risk OB, making sure you're on pregnancy safe meds. And then I always recommend that we wait to get pregnant until lupus is well controlled. Is going to be the best events from that. So in terms of pregnancy safe medications, hydroxychloroquine is recommended throughout pregnancy because it does help reduce like preeclampsia risk. And if they're SSA positive, one of the serologies is positive, they're at higher risk for having a baby with neonatal lupus, which can affect the heart. So it helps prevent that. So we definitely keep them on hydroxychloroquine. Unfortunately, we're really limited in meds that we feel 100% confident are safe as much as we can. So azathioprine is one of them. So I'll switch patients to that if they have a history of nephritis. We usually feel pretty confident, though if you look at it, it's technically a class D, but most obstetricians feel really safe with using that. And then you can use things like tacrolimus or calcineurin inhibitors, not voclosporin. Voclosporin has not been approved yet for pregnancy, but we can use those if we need to, again, for kidney involvement. But mycophenolate, really high rates of miscarriages and fetal malformation, so we try to avoid that for sure. Methotrexate is not far behind in its rate of adverse effects. Cyclophosphamide, obviously, we try to avoid. Rituximab, Benlysta are kind of in the intermediate. They've not been approved. We don't have enough research. We have some data coming from the cancer patients that rituximab is probably safe, but if you give it more towards the end of pregnancy, the baby may have issues with low blood counts and probably shouldn't get live vaccines for the first 6 months and stuff like that. But I have used rituximab during pregnancy, and Benlysta I have used like in the first trimester. We usually feel pretty safe with those. But towards the end of this second, third trimesters, you got to kind of weigh the pros and cons. If their lupus really needs it, sometimes you have to. But I'm fortunate to have really good high risk OB doctors here that I work closely with. So
that's great. And your patients are really great to have you, by the way, as a rheumatologist, to guide them through all of this. I definitely picked up on you saying that for a lot of these drugs, there's just not enough research to know whether you can competently prescribe it during pregnancy. And so I just wanted to, make the audience aware and that obviously like pregnancy registries and just tracking obviously women that are pregnant are not included in clinical trials. And so we have to end up just watching these women in the real world and seeing how they actually do with these medications. And so either standalone pregnancy registries, which we have done a lot of at Alera Health, but also like within the Forward Lupus Registry, something that we've been more intentional about is tracking family planning goals and also pregnancy outcomes so that we have a better sense and can contribute more of this to the research community too. But it obviously takes time, it takes patience taking the medication, which can be hard. Speaking of getting patients into a study, I wanted to switch to maybe clinical trials. Christina, I wanted to ask you about whether you've been invited to participate in any clinical trials for lupus or heard of any that you were interested in, what that journey has been like for you.
Yes. So as I had mentioned earlier, for me, sometimes I'm waiting for that next medication, right? And so it's probably been about 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Benlysta had come out. As soon as it came out, I was probably one of the first people because I was in that realm. But then after several treatments, I could not take it. My body did not like it. When I had my next flare, it was really about steroids, and the Benlysta wasn't helping. We were using steroids. We knew we needed something else. So she suggested a trial. So we went through that whole process, and it was my first time, you know, being a nurse. I know the importance of trials. She ended up giving me a booklet that was extremely thick to read all the details. I read through it. Let me tell you, from a patient perspective, it's scary when you read, because of course you have to put every possibility in there. And so then you begin to question. And so then I had to put my clinical hat on and go, no, they have to mention everything, and you know, you need something. So long story short, I sat down with my husband. He read through it too. I said, look, I'm gonna attempt. So that started the journey, which was tons of blood work, probably 24 tubes of blood, which I never had blood that much drawn at one time. Study, radiology tests, I mean, tons of questionnaires. So you go through this process, one, of really talking yourself into it, two, committing to it, going through all of this. Then I hear, yes, they've accepted me into the study. I have a date for my first treatment, whatever that is, placebo or drug being studied. The afternoon before, I got a phone call from my rheumatologist's office, and they said, hey, Christina, I am so sorry. The study group reviewed your case once more, and they're pulling you out of the study. I was so disappointed because I had gone through the emotional aspect of gearing myself up for it. I was hopeful that I was going to get the drug and that it was going to work, and then to hear not. So they said, don't worry about it, doctor. My doctor wants to see you next week. We're going to talk about it. So when I went to her the following week, she explained to me, and this is what she explained. She said, you know, unfortunately, lupus is, everybody's lupus affects them differently, which I completely get. She said when drugs are trying to get approved, they want individuals in a really tight cohort so that they can prove that the drug is going to work. Unfortunately, I'm a little oddball in the sense that it was affecting my muscles, it was affecting my nervous system. I had a positive EMG, so I knew I had an inflammation in my muscles, but it wasn't exactly what they were looking for. So she said, okay, now we have to try something else, because we were so hopeful for that. So I ended up going on IVIG for several treatments until I couldn't take that either. And then used steroids until finally it got under control by itself, and then something else happened. So studies are needed. I think there is tight control on them in the sense of a control group. And unfortunately, lupus patients are not all alike. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
Jennifer, can I jump in very, very quickly on that? Because I think that Christina's testimonial is so critical and so important for the industry world as well. This is exactly what the industry partner have to hear before before, hopefully, embarking in the whole setting up of the clinical trial process, plan, etc. And there are so many points about what Christina said that needs to be checked in advance. The feasibility of the trial, the communication style. Christina mentioned a very thick book of information and not very patient-friendly information to assimilate. This is all things that needs to be checked in advance. And also being lupus, such a heterogeneous disease with such prevalence of highly subjective symptoms, pain, fatigue, we mentioned out of all of those, it's so important also to benchmark the PRO's measurement systems that are currently available and declinate them into the subgroup population in order not to have a successful clinical trial, hopefully a good recruitment and retention of patients, and also to avoid disappointment towards the patient population. So this is all great points for Christina, and all things that needs to be strategically implemented for industry partners early in development.
Totally. And something else that strikes me is just obviously I'm in the real world solutions team, so real world evidence is kind of my jam right now. And when we have such strict eligibility criteria where such a narrow percent of actual real world patients with lupus can enter a trial, then that highlights even more the importance of us studying what's happening in the real world after approval, so we can get signals of, okay, well, for this subgroup that wasn't even included in the trial, then how is it for them? Maybe it's fabulous. Maybe it actually performs really well in that group, and we wouldn't have known otherwise if we hadn't studied them and done that research. So going to conferences like ACR and UR and seeing what people are reporting on how these drugs are doing in the real world is very exciting for me. I want to make sure you guys put any questions that you have in the chat. We're going to go for one last comment from Jen, and then we'll start taking questions. So feel free to fill them up because Jen, the last question I wanted to ask is to you about your involvement with clinical trials. I know that you are a center for a few different ones. And yeah, I wanted to hear, tell us about the trials that you are participating in as a site. And then also if you have any kind of takeaways that you feel are important for the life science research community when they are setting up these trials and working with sites would also be good for folks to take away.
Yeah, so we've got a few that are ongoing. Probably the biggest one I have is, and as many of you probably are aware, kind of the biggest thing going on in the lupus world now, a big talk is CAR T-cell therapy. So we are a site for that, phase 1. So it's obviously very early still. So we've treated one patient at our location, 2 at a sister location. I have a second one here, a fourth one total, who's going to be getting treated the next couple of weeks. So that probably takes up most of my time with the clinical trials. So that one's been enlightening, obviously for many reasons, as Christina alluded to. Definitely they have to be really strict with the criteria, which makes it difficult because you're not capturing everybody. So definitely if anyone ever has nerve involvement, they're always excluded, similar with this trial. And and if they have other autoimmune diseases and things like that, it can be really difficult. But I understand, especially with CAR T cells, is a very a very significant treatment that could potentially have very significant adverse effects. So we're still in the early phases. So I get restricting the use. We're restricting use by age too. So, but hopefully over time we can, broaden the criteria so that we can hopefully treat other patients, because it'll be, obviously we need to know if it's effective for the most severe cases, and that's usually cases where it's affecting the brain and the nervous system. So that's always, I think, an area that's really hard with lupus. And then we have a trial going on too with a couple of trials going on with skin, hoping to get anifrolumab approved for cutaneous limited disease through a sub-Q injection, and looking at another one in the JAK-STAT inhibitor pathway for skin, and doing another one with nephritis, looking at a complement inhibitor. So there's so many. It's exciting to have all these different trials going on, but obviously it's a lengthy process, but it's exciting times. But yeah, I think there's always going to be challenges with lupus, just the way it's just so heterogeneous. It's really hard to capture everybody, and I get why we have restrictions in trials, but I think that you make a good point, Jennifer. It's like looking at, once things get approved, and having the data to say, hey, the patients that maybe weren't included in the trials, how are they responding in the real world is something that's helpful, at least to know and to track.
Can I add on that, Jennifer, very quickly before we open the Q&A? I just wanted to build up on that and taking a little bit the other perspective, not the industry one. It's an exciting time for the industry partner of this puzzle. It also means that it is a crowded time, and market access, for example, challenges are expected, considering the difficulty to compare and trials, for example, because of the heterogeneity of the population that we talk about, etc. So it's very important to understand that the patient perspective becomes key more and more in this panorama, because it's important to talk to patients and the specific subpopulations to create patient-focused value story in order to showcase to, for example, FDA and then payers the stronger added value of a treatment for patients versus the other, for example, or versus the standard of care, as well as showcase strong payer value story and TPP that really reflect the patient needs. So in this environment, in this exciting environment, the patient perspective becomes clear also for the later phases of development, regulatory market access.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Julia. So one question, which I think is very interesting, and I'm excited to hear how everyone responds. Is a flare the same for physician versus patient? Do they have the same definition of a flare? Christina, do you want to maybe comment first if you would like, or if someone else feels very strongly that they would like to comment?
I'll start. So I've been blessed to have the same rheumatologist the entire course of my treatment thus far. So I think because we've been going through the journey at the same time, my definition is the same definition as my rheumatologist. It becomes, I think what I've learned is it depends on how it's impacting your life, right, at the time. And so you have some symptoms that are so blatant, they show up in tests, or you have rashes on your body, it's so blatant, but some of the stuff you can't see, right? I always see the picture where they use a glacier, and you know, the symptoms that people can see is up at the top, but how the patient feels is underneath the water. It's all that other stuff that people can't see as a patient, but also somebody working in healthcare. And my team at work knows my journey. They'll be like, "Oh, you look great," and it's like inside I'm like, "Oh," but I can see where my rheumatologist and I have that same definition, but I do think that that relationship between the patient and their rheumatologist is so key in how your journey will go. I've been very blessed.
Jen, Julia, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends. I mean, there's definitely been times where I've seen it on both sides, where, I mean, sometimes we're all in agreement. It's like, very clearly your lupus is flaring. And sometimes it's we're not in agreement, and it can be really challenging because, you know, even just a couple weeks ago, and I'm seeing this patient again today, she's clearly flaring. Her kidneys aren't happy, but she feels well. And so sometimes you'll see the opposite, where I know we always talk about, well, a patient will feel tired and fatigued and these things. We're like, well, your labs look good, everything else looks good. So sometimes that can be challenging. Is there something else contributing to the fatigue? And that's always challenging. But sometimes it can be the flip side, where the patient actually feels well, but then their numbers don't look good, or their kidneys don't look good. And so I've had the flip side be true, and they're young and they're like, well, I feel fine. So they're not really motivated to take their medications. And so it can be really challenging to sometimes approach that when the patient feels well, but their numbers don't look good, or vice versa. They don't feel well, but their numbers look good, trying to kind of find some middle ground, and kind of sometimes convince my patients, yes, you need to take your medicines, or maybe we need to look for something else that's maybe causing your symptoms. So it can be challenging. So, but I think Christina makes a great point. It's really helpful when you do have that long-term connection. So I'm hoping with this new patient that's not doing well, I think she's doing well. You know, she's still new to me, so hopefully over time, you know, you build that trust, because it really does take having a good trusting relationship with your provider and patient provider relationship to really help. So it comes with time, but it can be challenging for sure.
Julia,
maybe one last comment from my side is that this is a clear example of what we have been saying. Also, why I need to talk to patients from my industry perspective along the whole product development because of that, because the disease is subjective, some symptoms are subjective, because they are also silent, a little bit like Christina said, and Jennifer also second on that. And sometimes we don't have the same perception of symptoms and explanation of what something can mean for a stakeholder versus another. And that's why we needed to put at the center the patient perspective, which is now the great equalizer of all these pieces that are coming together, and what has to bring the product development from the beginning in order to be meaningful for the patient community, and on along the full journey in order to make sure that then treatment are correctly received by the community, and also there is a correct adherence towards the treatment. So yeah, that's a clear example of why the conversation with patients is key, and has to be not one stop, at the beginning, maybe of product development, but ongoing through all the phases of development.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment. We've really been diving deep into patient-reported outcome measures and which ones we can select, which ones we should select and have patients fill out in the Forward Lupus Registry, and also how we can use that information. And a lot of times there is not really concordance between, we ask patients like, oh, have you had a flare? And so we usually try to go possibly get medical records to verify that that was actually a flare that a clinician would recognize and would have also diagnosed as a flare. And a lot of times it doesn't necessarily match up. I want to just also comment, that doesn't mean that one is more valid or one is more important than another. If it's so significant in a patient's life that it's being so disruptive that they feel they need to go to a hospital or they need to have a treatment change, then that is a very valid, experience that the patient is having. And also, if your organs are being very damaged and you might not be feeling it, but it's going to cause really horrible long-term consequences to your body, then if a clinician is recognizing that, that's also very valid. So I think this is a dance that we constantly see in lupus of what the clinician thinks or the clinician says or the clinician sees is not always exactly what the patient is thinking, feeling, seeing. And I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that both of those are valid. Both of those should be measured. Both of those should be, studied. And, it's just part of lupus that they don't always line up. Okay, so I think I'm not surprised by this question. Recruitment and retention in clinical trials is always usually the biggest problem. So just at a global level, this person wants to know, how do we get more patients enrolled in lupus clinical trials, and how do we keep them retained in the trial for longer?
I can provide my perspective, but maybe
Sure.
Christine and Jennifer also have more direct perception. We have talked about it. It's about strategically plan your trial. This is already a big, great point to start. Christina mentioned, I'm repeating what I'm saying before. Christina mentioned a lot of points that usually happen in clinical trials, not only lupus, in general clinical trials that are not patient friendly, and makes the journey of a patient that has to enroll in a trial more difficult. These are already little things and changes that we can do to facilitate the process for patients and stay enrolled for hopefully the full length of the trial. Then there is another important point that you just mentioned, Jennifer, the patient-reported outcomes, the PRO validation with patients. Patient needs to understand that the trial is going to be valid and for them, not only feasible. And in a disease like lupus, the patient-reported outcomes selection is key, but also making sure with patients that those are comprehensible for them. Sometimes we give for granted that we are talking to patients that may come from many different backgrounds and have many different, accessibility to information, and making sure that they will understand what we mean with measurement systems that are maybe old, So we need to make sure that there is comprehensibility here. And then it's co-designing with patient is something that we have been working on a lot in the last years, and is something that definitely helps. That of course is a tricky part for the all clinical trials, to be honest.
Thanks, Julia. Any other pressing thoughts?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I agree with the patient-reported outcomes. I think are important, and we're including those more in trials and treatment guidelines and things like that to the ACR/EULAR. So I think that's helpful. I think that really is really important for our patients. So as I know our CAR T cell trial we have going on now, FACIT fatigue is one of the things we're measuring, and fatigue is a huge issue for lupus, and one that us as physicians hardly ever have a good impact on. It's frustrating, and so it's really important for the patient. And so I think that was really something that got my patients that are enrolling in like really excited. It's like, oh, we have an impact on my fatigue, and I get to like have a say in how I think I'm responding, and not just with the objective measurements that we usually use. So I think that's really helpful. And then some of it's just really hard practical stuff. So I mean, we're trying to enroll. We talked about how lupus can be more impacted for kind of racially diverse, people who are socioeconomically not in a good place, and so that can be really hard too. So I know our trials, it's like having those ability to like, we help with travel, we have childcare, we have all the stuff that we can help, because some people it's just practically they can't do these trials, and so trying to make sure that we're studying these in the sickest patients and not, and getting better representation is helpful. So having some of those things into kind of practical stuff in trials is helpful too. That support for patients.
Christina, anything from you?
Yes, so it's interesting because I've got two different hats, right? And so I'm like listening to both of them. From a patient perspective, I think awareness, right? Probably awareness that is consolidated in a document that is easily read. Because even that booklet for me, having clinical understanding, I had to read it a couple of different times, right? I think every patient knows that there is a possibility of all kinds of things happening anytime you take any medication, but how can you simplify it to where the person understands it in a consolidated way and highlight the areas of which you believe that potentially this future approved medication will work. So you have an understanding, look, we believe that this is going to impact this and this. Because then if I would have read that and realized maybe that wasn't going to be a fit for me, then maybe I wouldn't have gone through all of that. Unfortunately for me, based on the experience that I had, I'm probably going to have to be in a really good mental space to be in a place to attempt to do a trial in the future, right? Just because of my experience. So I just think those are a couple of things that maybe could have been done differently, and then the experience would have been done, I would have had a different experience.
Yeah, I would also add, something that I was at a meeting a couple weeks ago where we had a lot of patients in the room, people with lupus, and having a plain language summary of the trial for participants who are considering joining, and even better, a video. I'm personally, someone's like, oh, this great book is out, and I'm like, okay, well, tell me when it's on Netflix, and then I'll actually pay attention. So I'm much more of a video learner than a reading learner. So those are some very basic things that patients were like, that's not required already. So that, I think for me, the three biggest things off the top of my head are just meeting patients where they are. Minimizing the burden for patients. So similar to what you were saying about transportation and childcare is even better. I don't see that very much in trials, but that's like, gold standard to provide childcare assistance if needed. And then maximizing value, which obviously when we talk about a trial, we can't like overly compensate patients for participating. They should be paid fair market value for the time that they're putting in, for sure. But on top of that, there's other ways that we can provide value back to patients. One is returning data back to them. So, when it's feasible, when it's, kind of like allowed per the trial's protocol, to return the data back to them that they were contributing to the trial, and also returning the results of the trial back to them. So when you do release the results and you publish a plain language summary and return it back to the patients that participated in the trial. There's a lot more things that you can do in all of those three areas, and I'm more than happy to chat with anyone in depth about it because I have a lot of thoughts here. But we are at the last minute, and so we do actually have to wrap up. I'm sure everyone has places to be. I want to super thank you guys for joining us today, not just our panelists, but also the folks in the room that took time out of their day to come and join. we will send you guys a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar. So again, either you can rewatch, or if there's someone that you think would find this valuable, feel free to send it along to them. And then finally, when you do exit out of the webinar, you will see a survey that will appear, and we would love your feedback. You know, if this was valuable to you, we would love to hear that, so we know that maybe we should do more of these. So thank you guys so much for joining. Super thank you to all of our speakers, and especially Christina. I know that sharing your own personal journey takes a lot of courage. So we really, really appreciate you being willing to do that and get into the nitty-gritty with us about the ups and the downs. Okay, well, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and happy Halloween.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice day.